The day they read my grandfather's will, my sister got the cash. My parents got the house and the land. And I got a broken-down storage shed that nobody had touched in years. Nobody questioned it. Nobody even looked at me. And for a long time, I told myself there had to be a reason, that he would never do something without a reason. What I did not know then was that inside that shed, something had been waiting for me. Something that had been placed there deliberately, quietly, and with more love than I had ever been shown in a single room. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because before I tell you what was inside that shed, I need to tell you who he was and who I was before any of this happened. Because none of what followed would make sense without understanding where it all began. My name is Claire Ashworth, and if there is one thing I have come to understand about life, it is that people do not become who they are by accident. They are shaped slowly, quietly, and often by the hands of someone who chooses to see them differently from the rest of the world. For me, that person was my grandfather. His name was Arthur, and he was not just another elder in my family. He was the only person who ever made the world feel like it had a structure worth trusting. I did not grow up in a home where emotions were freely spoken. My parents were present in the physical sense, but distant in the way that some people are when they have decided that practicality matters more than depth. Words in our house were formal, conversations were brief, affection existed more in obligation than in genuine expression. My sister, Diane, adapted to that environment the way water finds its level. She learned how to be seen, how to say the right things at the right moments, how to move through the world in a way that earned approval without requiring real understanding. I never learned that. I was always the one sitting slightly outside of everything, watching, trying to make sense of something nobody around me seemed to think needed explaining. And then there was Arthur. He was not loud. He was not dramatic. He did not enter rooms in a way that demanded attention. But when he was present, something in the atmosphere shifted. He carried a kind of stillness that did not feel like it, emptiness. It felt like depth. I remember the way he used to sit by the window every morning, holding his tea with both hands, as if the warmth itself was something worth being grateful for. He would call me over without raising his voice. Just a small gesture, a slight tilt of his head, and I would go. Because I always felt like something important was about to be said, and I did not want to miss it. He taught me things that were never written in any book I was given at school. Patience, he said, was not about waiting. It was about how you behaved while you waited. Loyalty was not about staying when things were easy. It was about staying when staying felt like the harder choice. And strength, according to him, was never loud. It did not announce itself. It simply endured. At the age I first heard these things, I did not fully understand them. But I felt them. I felt them in the way he treated people who did not treat him well. I felt them in the way he listened, without interrupting. I felt them in the way he never seemed to rush through a single moment, as if every breath had value worth respecting. He never measured success in material terms. While conversations at family dinners revolved around who had earned more, or achieved more, or appeared more successful, Arthur spoke about character. He would say that people would forget what you have owned, but they would never forget how you made them feel. That sentence stayed inside me longer than any lesson I was ever formally taught. It became the quiet foundation of everything I would later choose, and everything I would later refuse. If this is already pulling at something inside you, something that reminds you of a person in your own life who shaped you without you fully realizing it, I want you to stay with this story. Because what happened next changed everything I thought. I understood about love, about loss, and about what it really means to be seen by someone. And if you have never subscribed to this channel, right now is a good moment, because every story here is built the same way this one is. Slowly, honestly, and with nothing left out that matters. As I grew older, I began to notice the gap between the world Arthur showed me and the world my family lived in. He never compared me to Diane. He never suggested I was too sensitive or too quiet or too much of anything. Instead, he asked me questions that no one else thought to ask. What do you believe in, Claire? He asked me that once, sitting by that same window, the light coming through at an angle that made everything look softer. Then it was. I remember going completely silent. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I genuinely did not know. I had spent so much of my life answering questions about performance that I had never been asked about identity. He smiled at my silence, not with disappointment, with patience. "It is fine if you do not know yet," he said, "but do not live your whole life without finding out." That became the quiet compass of my thinking. Not a rule, not an instruction, just a direction. My parents saw Arthur as traditional, sometimes overly sentimental, too idealistic for a world that required practicality. They respected him in the way people respect things they do not fully understand. Diane found his way of thinking unnecessary. She was interested in outcomes, not philosophies, but I found something in him that I could not locate anywhere else. A kind of emotional clarity. When I was with him, I was not performing. I was not trying to earn anything. I was simply existing, and that existence felt like enough. Over time, he became my anchor. When I was confused, I went to him. When I was silent, he understood without needing an explanation. When I doubted myself, he did not offer empty reassurance. He offered perspective. He once told me not to fear being different from my family. He told me to fear becoming someone I did not respect. Those words shaped me more than any expectation or rule ever could. I did not realize it then, but my entire sense of self was being constructed quietly through his presence. He was not trying to mold me. He was teaching me how to think independently, while staying grounded in values that did not shift with time or trend or approval. Even in small things, his influence was constant. The way I listened before speaking, the way I refused to judge quickly, the way I paid attention to what people did rather than what they said. These were not habits I picked up from my environment. They were lessons absorbed from him, without me ever sitting down to learn them. And yet, life in my home continued as usual. My family remained focused on appearances and structure and expectations. I lived between two worlds, one that valued surface, and one that valued depth. Arthur was the bridge, and I never questioned which world I truly belonged to, because I already knew the answer. I belonged to the world he was teaching me to see. What I did not know then was how fragile that foundation would feel when it was tested, or how deeply everything I had built around his presence would be shaken when that presence was gone. Because before everything changed, before anything was taken or revealed, my life rested on one simple certainty. I was Arthur's granddaughter, and that had always felt like enough. I still remember the day I noticed it for the first time, the change. It did not arrive dramatically. He did not collapse or announce anything. It came quietly, the way all the important things in his life had always come. A slower walk, a longer pause between sentences, a tiredness behind his eyes that he tried to hide behind the same calm expression he had always carried. I told myself it was nothing. He was strong. In my mind, he had always been strong. But strength, I would learn, does not mean immunity. It only means endurance. One evening I found him sitting by the window longer than usual. The tea beside him had gone cold, untouched. I called his name and he looked at me, but the response came a half-second too late. That small delay, that silence between my voice and his recognition, unsettled me in a way I could not explain. It was the first time I truly felt afraid of losing him. The diagnosis came shortly after. The words the doctor used were clinical and measured. Long-term illness, progressive weakness, ongoing monitoring required. I remember how the room felt after those words. My parents exchanged practical concerns. Diane asked logistical questions, but I could not hear any of it clearly. Something inside me had gone still. From that moment, my life stopped being divided between school and friendships and personal space. It narrowed into one single focus: him. I began spending more time in his room than in my own. Visits became routine. Routine became necessity. I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before. The way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for a glass. The way his voice, once so steady, now carried a quiet exhaustion underneath every word. But even in that weakness, he never complained. That was what hurt the most. He bore it all without asking for sympathy, without making anyone feel burdened by his suffering. And somehow that dignity made me stay closer, not further. There were nights I sat awake beside him not because I had to, but because I could not bring myself to leave him alone. I would watch the steady rhythm of his breathing and feel something settle inside me, as though my presence in that chair was the only useful thing I could offer the world. Sometimes he would wake and find me there. "You should sleep, Claire," he would say softly. and I would tell him I was fine. But I was not fine. I was learning what it meant to carry emotional weight that had nowhere to go. My friendships faded. Invitations went declined. Phone calls went unanswered. Not because I stopped caring, but because I no longer had the capacity to exist in two places at once. My life outside that room slowly became something I used to belong to. And yet I did not resent any of it. Because every time I looked at him, I knew that walking away would have been a betrayal I was not capable of making. There were moments of silence between us in those months that said more than any conversation could. He would look at me while I adjusted his pillow or set his medicine on the table beside him. And in those looks I saw not just appreciation, but recognition. He knew what I was giving up. He never said it directly. But one evening, as the sun was going down, and the room filled with that heavy orange light that makes everything feel slower, he spoke without looking at me. "You are missing too much of your life for me," he said. I shook my head immediately. "It is not a loss if I am choosing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned slightly toward me. "Everything you give leaves something behind," he said. I did not know how to answer that, so I stayed quiet. But something changed between us in that silence. He saw my sacrifice not as obligation, but as choice. And I understood that his awareness of it was not guilt. It was a quiet and permanent gratitude. As the months continued, so did my responsibility. I learned medication schedules and dietary adjustments and small physical routines that required patience I did not know I had. I stopped measuring time in days or weeks. Everything became about moments. Whether he was comfortable, whether he needed me, whether I was there when it counted. Even in his weakness, he maintained his dignity. When I helped him with things he could no longer do easily, he would sometimes close his eyes. Not out of frustration, out of acceptance. And in those moments I began to understand something deeper about who he was. His strength had never been physical. It had always been emotional. He had always been the kind of person who refused to let pain define him. And somewhere in those long, quiet months, I inherited that. Not his money, not his property, his silence, his endurance, his way of feeling everything without letting it become the loudest thing in the room. Now I need you to hold on to this part of the story, because what I am about to tell you is where everything you thought you understood gets turned completely upside down. The morning I found him, it began like every other morning. I walked into his room carrying his medication, already moving through the routine that had become second nature to me. The curtains were half open. A soft gray light came through. The air felt different. I could not explain why. He was lying still. At first I assumed he was resting. I stepped closer. I called his name. There was no response. I called again, louder this time, and my voice broke before I even understood why. Still nothing. And in that silence, something inside me collapsed in a way that had no sound and no name. I do not remember the exact moment I understood. There was no single clear thought. It was more like my mind refused to accept what my body already knew. My hands trembled as I reached for him, but nothing changed. The world did not stop. The room did not react. Everything remained exactly as it was, except him. When others arrived, the room filled with voices. My parents, the doctor, someone from outside the house. Their words blended into noise I could not process. I remembered only fragments. It was expected. He passed peacefully, peacefully. That word felt unbearable because nothing about my world felt peaceful anymore. When I took him away, I stayed in the room. Long after it had emptied, the chair by the window was still there, the cold tea still untouched. Everything looked the same, as if he might return at any moment and continue the morning as usual, but he did not. And that was when I understood absence for the first time. Not as distance, as permanence. The days that followed were blurred and shapeless. People came and went. Conversations happened around me rather than with me. My family processed grief the way they processed everything else. Efficiently, formally, with clear structure and socially appropriate containment. Mine had no structure at all. I stopped recognizing time. Morning and night became meaningless. Food tasted like nothing. Words felt unnecessary. Even breathing felt like something I was doing out of habit, rather than intention. At the funeral, I stood with my family, but I was not fully present. People spoke about his life and his legacy and his character. They used words like respected and honorable and steady. All of it was true. None of it captured what he meant to me, because what I had lost was not just a person. I had lost my center. And when it was over, I did not feel closure. I felt the kind of emptiness that does not get filled with time. The kind that becomes part of you and simply changes shape as you grow around it. That night, I returned to my room and sat in silence. For the first time in months, I was not needed anywhere. No routines, no schedules, no care to give. Only absence. And in that absence, I finally stopped avoiding the truth I had been carrying for weeks. Arthur was gone, and part of me had gone with him. If you have ever lost the person who understood you before you understood yourself, you already know exactly what that feels like. And you already know that no amount of time makes the first days easier. Stay with this story, because what came next is something I still think about every single day. And it changes everything. The letter from the lawyer's office arrived 11 days after the funeral. My family treated it as a formality. Diane seemed unsurprised. My parents seemed prepared. I went because they said I should. Because they said everything would be divided fairly. That word, fairly, had already started feeling hollow before I even walked through the door. The lawyer's office was the kind of room that has no interest in human emotion. Clean surfaces, neutral colors. A large table with water glasses, nobody touched. My parents sat with composed expressions. Diane checked her phone twice before the lawyer even entered. I sat slightly outside myself, the way I had been sitting since the funeral. Present in body, absent in everything else. The lawyer carried a thick file. He adjusted his glasses, greeted us formally, and began reading. At first the words sounded mechanical to me. Legal terms, property, references, financial summaries. It all felt distant until it became specific. The estate consisted of a house, a parcel of land, liquid cash assets, and a storage shed at the edge of the property. My parents received the house and the land. There was no discussion, no pause. It was accepted with the quiet ease of something that had already been decided long before this room. Diane received the cash assets. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her posture straightened slightly. She did not look at me. Then there was a pause. The lawyer looked at his file again. He said my name, Claire Ashworth. I looked up. For one brief moment, I let myself believe that something meaningful was coming. Not because I expected wealth, but because I believed in Arthur. I believed that whatever he had arranged would carry his intention, his understanding of who I was. The storage shed is allocated to you. I blinked. I was certain I had misheard. The storage shed? Not a portion of the land, not a share of the assets, not even an acknowledgement of the months I had spent in that house caring for him around the 2 o'clock. Just the shed. The small, weathered structure at the edge of the property that everyone had always used to store broken things nobody wanted to deal with. I looked at my family. I expected someone to react. Some confusion, some discomfort, some small movement that acknowledged the strangeness of the moment. But there was nothing. My parents did not question it. Diane did not react at all. The lawyer continued reading as if the allocation were completely unremarkable. And in that silence, something became painfully clear to me. No one in that room was going to speak on my behalf. I did not cry. I did not stand up. I did not say a single word about how I felt, not because I was strong in that moment, but because Arthur had taught me that silence was sometimes the only response that protected your dignity. So I held it, and I sat there inside that sentence. The storage shed is allocated to you, until the meeting ended and chairs moved and papers were collected and everyone stood. And life moved forward as if nothing had happened. Outside the building, my family walked slightly ahead of me, already talking about plans, already discussing decisions. Nobody looked back. I followed behind them without speaking, and somewhere inside the heaviness of that walk, something unexpected happened. Alongside the pain, there was a question. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Why would he leave me this? Not anger, not resentment. Just that, repeating itself. Because I knew Arthur, and Arthur never did anything without a reason. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the shed, not as a property, as a message I had not yet read. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently my family was processing the same event. My parents spoke about ownership and future plans. Diane had already moved forward, but I had slowed down entirely. Something essential inside me was still trying to understand what had actually been given and what had actually been taken. I did not argue with anyone. I did not confront anyone. What I did instead was withdraw, not out of avoidance, out of the need to think without noise. I began to hold on to my memories of Arthur more deliberately, not the final months, but the earlier ones. The window, the tea, the questions he asked that nobody else thought to ask. And slowly, the unfairness of the inheritance stopped occupying the center of my emotions. It moved to the edges, and something else moved in to take its place. Curiosity. About the shed. About why it had been chosen. About what he had known that I had not yet seen. My grandfather had always been deliberate, even in silence. He communicated intention, and that shed, that forgotten structure at the edge of everything, had been deliberately assigned to me. That choice had to carry meaning. I just had not found it yet. I waited, not for resolution, for understanding. I did not go to the shed immediately. I gave myself time, because I knew that when I went, I needed to go without expecting anything. I needed to simply arrive and be present, the way he had always taught me to be present, without agenda, without performance, without needing the moment to be more than what it was. The day I finally went, the sky was flat and gray. The air had that particular heaviness that comes before a storm that never quite arrives. I walked alone to the edge of the property, away from the main house, where the rest of life was already. Continuing without a pause. The shed stood there exactly as I remembered it. Old, weathered, slightly leaning with age. The wood had darkened over the years. The paint had peeled away in uneven places. To anyone else it would have looked like nothing. Abandoned, forgotten, useless. To me it felt like a sentence I had not yet finished reading. I stood in front of the door for a long moment. Then I opened it. The hinges creaked loudly, breaking the quiet in a way that made me pause. Dust moved through the thin shaft of light coming from outside. The air inside had not been disturbed for a long time. There were old things inside, covered objects, broken furniture, tools that had not been used in years. The kind of place where memories go when nobody knows what else to do with them. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The sound echoed softly. The space felt smaller, with the door closed. More enclosed, more private. And for the first time since everything had happened, I was completely alone. Not surrounded by expectations or conversations or decisions. Just silence. And in that silence, I began to remember him more clearly. Not the version of him from those last difficult months, but the one from before. The one who sat by the window. The one who listened without interrupting. The one who told me that strength did not need to be loud. I moved slowly through the shed, not looking for anything specific, just being present inside it. I stopped near an old wooden shelf and rested my hand on its surface. Dust covered my fingers. I did not wipe it away. I stood there thinking about everything. The house, the land, the money, and then this place. And the thought returned, steadier than before. Arthur had never been careless, not once in his entire life. Every choice he made carried weight. This one had to as well. I was about to turn back toward the door when I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow and deliberate. Not the footsteps of someone uncertain. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I turned toward the door. A moment later, it opened. A woman stood in the entrance. She appeared to be in her late 60s or perhaps older. She wore a deep navy coat that looked old-fashioned but well-maintained. Her posture was straight. Her expression was calm, almost completely unreadable. There was something about her presence that did not feel accidental. It felt arranged. Her eyes met mine briefly, then moved around the inside of the shed, as if confirming she had arrived at the correct location. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence between us felt heavier than the dust in the air. Then she stepped inside. "I was told to find you here," she said. Her voice was steady, not emotional, not uncertain. It carried the particular weight of someone who has repeated something in their mind many times before finally speaking it aloud. I frowned slightly. "Who told you?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached slowly into her coat and withdrew a small locked box. It was medium in size, made of dark wood, with metal edges. It looked old, but intentionally preserved. Not forgotten, protected. She held it out toward me but did not release it right away. "Your grandfather," she said at last. My breath slowed. I stepped closer. "That is not possible," I said quietly. Her expression did not change. "He gave me my instructions 10 years ago," she continued. "He told me exactly where to come and when to come. He said there would be a time when you would be here, alone." The word alone felt deliberate when she said it, as if it had been specifically chosen. I looked at the box. Something about this moment did not feel like a coincidence. It felt like a structure, like something that had been arranged long before I understood I was part of it. She placed the box into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, not physically, emotionally, like it carried accumulated meaning that had not yet been allowed to speak. "There is one condition," she said. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You must open it alone. No one else can be present. Not before, not during, not after. Only you." I looked at her, searching her face for more. There was nothing there but certainty. "And if I do not open it?" I asked quietly. She paused for the first time. Then she said in a lower voice, "Then it will remain closed forever." That sentence stayed in the air after she said it. I looked down at the box. My fingers tightened around it without intention. The questions came fast. Why this? Why now? Why me? Why alone? Why 10 years ago? But before I could ask any of them, she spoke one final time. "He said you would understand everything when the time came." And then she turned and walked away. No hesitation, no further explanation. The door closed behind her, and the shed returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It was occupied now, full of something I could not yet name. I stood there for a long time holding the box. Slowly I sat down on an old covered crate and placed it carefully on my lap. I traced my fingers over the surface. Smooth in some places, worn in others, as if it had been handled carefully over many years but never opened. Whatever was inside had been waiting longer than I had known, and for the first time since his death, what I felt was not grief. It was anticipation, because I understood now that this was not just a memory left behind. This was a message, and I was the only one who could open it. "Do not go anywhere," because what was inside that box is something I have thought about every single day since. And the moment I read his words, everything I thought I understood about what I had been given collapsed and rebuilt itself into something I had never imagined. Stay here. This is where the story becomes something else entirely. I placed my hand on the metal clasp. My fingers hesitated for only a moment. Then I opened it. The sound was soft, almost fragile, like the exhale of something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Inside, everything was arranged with deliberate care. Nothing was rushed or random. It was as if someone had organized this moment with patience that stretched across years. At the top was a folded letter. Below it lay a golden watch. Beside the watch, a carefully organized set of legal documents, and at the bottom, attached to a simple metal tag, a small bank locker key. I did not touch anything else. First, I picked up the letter. My hands felt unsteady as I unfolded it. The handwriting was immediately familiar. Calm, precise. Every letter formed with the same unhurried care he had applied to everything in his life. I began to read. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, it means time has finally aligned the way it was meant to. I did not leave you less. I left you differently. People often believe inheritance is about division, about who receives what. But true inheritance is not measured in property or money. It is measured in understanding, patience, and character. I watched you carefully, Claire, not only when you were with me, but when you thought no one was watching at all. I saw how you stayed when staying was difficult. I saw how you chose silence over resentment. I saw how you value people even when the world gave you no reason to. That is not weakness. That is rare strength." I stopped reading for a moment. Something in my throat had tightened. I breathed through it and continued. "Your family will not understand this decision immediately. Some things are not meant to be understood quickly. They will see division. You will see intention. I gave them what they could measure. I gave you what cannot be measured. The house and the land were never the true inheritance. They were responsibility. The cash was comfort. But neither of those required wisdom to receive. You required something different. You required trust. That is why I left you the shed first. Not because it was worthless, but because it was empty enough for truth to arrive without distraction. And now you will find what I prepared for you long before illness entered my life. I lowered the letter for a moment. The shed around me felt smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. I picked it back up. You were never the one I needed to provide for Claire. You were the one I trusted to carry forward what matters. Not wealth, not property, but values. The world will often misunderstand quiet people. But quiet does not mean absent. It means observing, learning, becoming. You were always my true heir, not of possessions, but of principle. I set the letter down slowly. For a long time I simply sat there. I did not cry immediately. The feeling was too large for tears at first. It arrived in layers, the way his lessons always had. Then I picked up the legal documents. My breath slowed as I began reading through them. They were not ordinary papers. They contained financial records, investment portfolios, international financial holdings, property shares, trust funds that had been active for years. Everything had been managed, everything had been maintained and strategically grown over time, and every single document bore my name. Not as a beneficiary of chance, as the central figure of a long-term plan that had been constructed with extraordinary care over many years. I froze. The reality did not land all at once. It came in layers, the way his presence always had. Quiet first, then undeniable. He had not simply left me wealth. He had built a structure around my life, a foundation that existed entirely below the surface. And it had been growing in the background while I lived my life. Without knowing it was there, I reached for the golden watch. It was heavier than it looked. The surface was polished but carried small marks of time, tiny scratches and worn edges that told me it had been held and considered many times before being placed here. I turned it slowly in my hand and then set it down carefully. Then I saw it. A second letter, separate from the first, tucked beneath the documents. My hands moved slowly as I opened it. Emma, if you are reading this here, then you have already begun to understand that wealth is not what changes a person. It is responsibility that does. I did not give you these assets to make your life easier. I gave them to ensure that you would always have the ability to choose integrity over necessity. Many people inherit comfort and lose direction. I wanted to make sure you inherited direction first. What you hold here is not the reward of my life's work. It is the continuation of it. And you are the only person I trusted to carry it forward without losing yourself. I closed my eyes. The silence in that small shed felt completely different now. Not empty. Full of meaning I was still learning to hold. I kept reading. Do not rush what this becomes. Do not let others tell you what to do with it. Let it sit with you. Let it ask you questions the way I used to ask you questions. And when you are ready, you will know what it is for. I set the letter down and looked at everything in front of me. The 2 letters, the watch, the documents, the key. And for the first time since his death, I did not feel empty. I felt chosen, not above my family, not above anyone, but for something specific, something that had been designed around who I actually was, not who anyone expected me to be. Outside, the world was unchanged. But inside that shed, everything had quietly become something different, and I understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The next morning I went to the bank alone. I told no one. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I understood instinctively that some truths need to be discovered privately before they can be shared. I presented the key at the counter and waited. After a few minutes I was guided through a secure hallway and led to a heavy metal door. You may proceed alone, the employee said. I nodded and stepped through. Inside was a quiet room lined with secure lockers, minimal, clean, untouched by the noise of the outside world. I found the designated locker and paused before inserting the key, not out of fear, out of understanding. Whatever was inside would not allow me to remain the same person who had walked in. I opened it. At first I saw only folders, neatly arranged documents, sealed envelopes, structured financial records. I took them out carefully and placed them on the small table provided. As I began going through them, the scale of what had been prepared became clear in a way I was not ready for. Long-term investment portfolios, international financial holdings, property shares registered entirely in my name, trust funds that had been accumulating quietly for years, every account managed with precision, every structure legally established and maintained. The numbers were significant, but what stopped me was not the scale of the wealth. It was the scale of the intention behind it. This was not a sum of money set aside. This was a system, a living financial architecture, built quietly in the background of my entire life without once disturbing my awareness of it. My grandfather had not simply accumulated wealth, he had directed it, shaped it, pointed it toward a specific person, me. Not after his death, long before it. This had been underway while I was still a child, sitting by a window asking him questions about patience. I leaned back in the chair and tried to absorb what I was seeing. This was preparation. This was care expressed through foresight rather than words. This was trust in its most concrete and lasting form. The kind of trust that does not require supervision. The kind that says, I know who you are, and I know what you will do with this, and so I have given you the time and the tools to become it. I sat in that room for a very long time. When I finally stood to leave, I gathered the documents carefully. Not like financial records, like letters, like extensions of him, because that is what they were. A continuation of everything he had believed I could become. I had not been left behind. I had been prepared for. I did not feel excitement walking out of that bank. There was no celebration, no rush of relief or victory. What I felt was clarity, a quiet and absolute understanding that what I had been given was not designed to change my lifestyle. It was designed to change my direction. For a long time I spoke to no one about what I had found, not because I feared the reaction, but because I needed time to understand what it meant inside my own hands before it became part of anyone else's reality. My grandfather had not built this for display. He had built it for purpose, and purpose, I had learned from him, could not be rushed. In the weeks that followed, I began observing the world differently. I found myself noticing things I had previously passed without thought. Elderly people, sitting alone in hospital waiting rooms, with no one beside them. Older men and women in parks whose faces carried the weight of being unseen. Families who spoke about their aging relatives with a tone of inconvenience rather than love. These images stayed with me. They reminded me of Arthur, of how he had deserved to be seen in his final years, of how carefully and quietly he had endured the slowness and difficulty of those months, of how rarely people who give their whole lives to others receive that same quality of presence in return. That was when the idea arrived, not as inspiration, as direction. I decided to build something, not for profit, not for recognition, not to prove anything to anyone. A welfare organization dedicated entirely to elderly individuals, people who had given their lives to their families and their communities and their work, only to find themselves unseen when they needed support the most. A place where the standard of care was dignity, where presence was not temporary, where no one would be made to feel like a burden simply because they had grown old. The planning was overwhelming at first. Legal structures to establish, locations to identify, the right people to bring in. But I did not feel lost in the process the way I might have expected. Every step felt familiar, in a way I could not fully explain, because I was not building something from nothing. I was continuing something that had already been started inside me over many years of quiet, patient, deliberate mentorship. I used the financial structure Arthur had left behind carefully, not as a windfall, as a long-term foundation. Every decision I made carried his values somewhere in the background. Patience, dignity, responsibility. The organization grew slowly and then steadily into something real, a place where people arrived feeling forgotten and gradually began to feel visible again, where care was offered without condition, where someone would always be there when they woke. My family never understood the decision. They saw it as excessive, emotional, impractical. They believed wealth was meant for personal stability, not social purpose. But I had stopped needing their understanding some time ago. What I was building was not for approval. It was for meaning. And meaning had its own momentum that approval never quite matched. There were moments of exhaustion, moments when the weight of what I had taken on felt very real. But even in those moments, I never felt alone inside the work. Because somewhere, in every decision I made, I felt a quiet continuation of him. Not through his voice, through the principles he had already placed inside me before I understood I was receiving them. What began as an idea became a structure. What began as a structure became a mission, and what began as a mission slowly became something that could outlive me, the same way his values had outlived him in me. If you have ever wondered whether one person can genuinely change the direction of another person's entire life without ever raising their voice or making a dramatic declaration, this is your answer. They can. Arthur did, and the proof of it is not in any document or financial record. It is in the fact that every morning when I walk into that organization and I see someone sitting quietly in a chair by a window holding a warm cup with both hands, I feel him there, not as memory, as continuation. I never used what he left me to build comfort. I used it to build meaning. Financial stability became the foundation. What mattered was what I chose to construct on top of it. A life that looked less like what the world expected of me, and more like what he had always known I was capable of. People asked me sometimes what my grandfather left me, and for a long time I struggled to answer simply. Now I do not struggle at all. He left me understanding. He left me patience. He left me the ability to see value in what other people dismiss. He left me the courage to choose depth over approval. And most importantly, he left me responsibility disguised as trust. The highest form of love he knew how to give. My family once saw the shed as the smallest and most insulting piece of a divided estate. It became the beginning of everything, and I am no longer defined by what I was given. I am defined by what I chose to build from it, because that is what he always knew. That legacy is not what you leave behind when you die. Legacy is what continues to live through others because of how you lived while you were here. His legacy is still alive. I carry it into every room I enter. I carry it into every decision I make. I carry it into every moment when I choose patience over reaction, depth over surface, character over approval. He shaped me slowly and quietly and without ever needing to announce it. And in doing so, he gave me something no document could formalize and no lawyer could read aloud in a clean, indifferent office. He gave me the ability to see clearly in the dark. And that, in the end, is the only inheritance that truly lasts. If Arthur's story moved something in you today, if it reminded you of someone who shaped you, quietly and without fanfare, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments who that person was. Or, tell me what you would have done if you had been sitting in that shed holding that box. I read every comment and I respond to as many as I can. And if you are not yet part of this community, please subscribe. Now, every week there is a new story here, told with honesty, told with care, told for the people who believe that the quiet moments are where the real things happen. This is one of those places. And I am glad you found it.